Hello, hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Secure Cloudcast on the, fourth Tuesday of the month this time. We got a
Sure,
little,
holidays and all, you
a
know.
lot of holidays, a lot of travel, but we're here. We'll be here again in 2 weeks doing our wrap up of the year. So the second Tuesday or third Tuesday of every month, we'll be doing the Secure Cloudcast. I'm your host. I'm Mike Foster, and I'm joined by the lovely
I'm Kim Carlos.
product
Today's
marketer.
I was like totally waiting for you to say it, and then you didn't.
I was
And
going to hand it off to you. Thanks again for joining. If you want to get more notifications, hit the little subscribe button and the bell. Again, like I said, the third Tuesday of every month at 2 p.m. Eastern. Today, we have a couple updates for you, and we're joined by the wonderful Bill Bensing. So without further ado, I think we should get in the updates, right, Kim?
yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. So there was, since it's been a month and a half since we talked last, there was a big vulnerability that came out, the OpenSSL vulnerability. It was handled very well for those of you in the security world that are paying attention. It was notified. Every big cloud provider put out their statement, and then it was updated with a fix on November 1st. So if you have OpenSSL 3.0.5 or 6, update to .7 in order to get those patches. It does not affect any of the previous versions. So if you have OpenSSL 1, you're okay. But yeah, it was a pretty big one. It was a high vulnerability, about a 7.8, and it would have caused with an with a malicious certificate, it would have brought down servers if you kept getting pinged. So check out that one. And if you want, ACS does have a policy for it specifically, so you can use that to identify your workloads. Two more things. One I want to talk about, and I'm sure Bill can get into this too when he comes on, is Red Hat community invalidated patterns. So we have a community pattern for the secure supply chain. They're very interesting. I'll post the link in the chat right after this. But really, community patterns at Red Hat have a list of requirements, things that must happen, things that should happen, and things that can or are nice to have requirements. Things like they should be available. Doesn't matter what your hardware is, you should be able to run it. So it's very useful if you want to check out patterns that we've used in community versions and production, which are called validated patterns. If you want to get into things like secure supply chain or GitOps, it's definitely worth checking out, and I'll drop that in the chat. I'm looking forward. The secure supply chain, I believe, is only a community pattern right now, but we're looking forward to it being a validated pattern very soon. And then the last thing, advanced cluster security is going to be updating to 3.73 very soon. We have some release notes that just got published internally. So in 3 weeks, I think 3 weeks when we meet.
December 5th is when the launches.
All right.
Release.
Well, yeah. So then the next time that we're together on the third Tuesday, we'll have an update for you on the release notes, what to expect, how to test it out, and we'll go a little bit more in depth. Did I wrap that all up right, Kim? I think I got it all. All right, sweet.
We talked about talking more about the roadmap for ACS, right? Specifically.
The roadmap will be, we'll have to see if that's going to be published publicly, but there's definitely the internal PMs are solidifying the roadmap, so look forward to that. Cool. All right, Kim, since Bill Bensing is your guest, do you want to do the honors of introducing him?
Sure. Do we have them all signed in now? Or are we going to?
Yeah, I'll bring him in. There you go.
All right, let's do it. Hey, Bill. Hey, Bill. I'm so glad that you're here. I wanted to ask you a few questions today, but let's get started a little bit about you telling us about you. Tell us a little bit more about what you do here at Red Hat and your background.
Oh, absolutely. This gets dangerous when somebody asks me to talk about myself.
I know, but it's so funny.
No, so actually, moving from managing, so my background here at Red Hat is I work in the North American Public Services. I focus with our government customers, moving actually over to our global organization, our Customer Success Office of Technology, to focus on application delivery globally. So a lot of what I do is work with our highly regulated organizations, whether it's banks, insurance, or nation states, whether it's the US and or our allied nation states, around how do we better build and deliver software. We talk about security and compliance, like a lot of those words are buzzwords, but how do we do it in a way that we're pulling, for example, like the hands of people out of the middle? How do we make it effective and efficient? Because the reality in most industries, a lot of it's theater, and people are really starting to talk about it. But then there's also like, okay, if it's theater, how do we actually address this and solve that problem? So that's where within Red Hat and outside with like for instance, the book released from IT Revolution that I co-authored, trying to work on the pragmatic approaches to make this work for the technologist as well as the non-technical leaders. So that's a bit about myself here at Red Hat.
Awesome.
No kidding. We actually recently had a conversation talking about how security and compliance can be an enabler for bigger companies and sort of a hindrance for smaller companies. There's a point at which, at scale, it starts to become extremely useful. I know, Kim, you had a bunch of questions you wanted to ask him, so I don't
Oh,
want to
yeah.
take over. You got to kick it off this time.
Okay. All right. So, Bill, a couple things I had kind of written down that I wanted to pick your brain about. I wanted you to walk us through something that you mentioned a few minutes ago, which is sort of like security and compliance and governance and what those things actually mean and how they can positively or negatively impact the application development process.
So security, compliance, and government. Let's get some epistemology here.
Yeah.
They're all three different, although a lot of organizations try to use those words interchangeably. I'm gonna put governance to the right-hand side on that right now and talk about security versus compliance. Let's just face it, they're different. They're not the same thing. It's and to explain the difference and like this, a lot of people listen to it like, oh, I know the difference, but have you asked yourself, could you explain this to a 10-year-old child? And I picked 10-year-old as an arbitrary number. Like, how could you do this? And this was part of as I was writing the book, Investments Unlimited, part of it is like, how do I write this and explain it to somebody that's like a non-technical and, an independent third party? So as we think about security and compliance, we need to acknowledge the difference that security is how we protect from an adversary. And compliance is how are we meeting third-party expectations. Mm-hmm. And I think that'd be the most simple way to do it. Now, there is a gray area where there may be a third-party compliance around how secure, like certain security things can't happen. That becomes a compliance check mark. But at the end of the day, security is how am I protecting my systems, my organization, my customers from some malicious actor trying to, exploit them for whatever reason, whether it's personal gain or, just fun in the sun. For whatever reason, it doesn't matter. How do I protect it? And then compliance is whether it's HIPAA, whether it's NIST 800-503, how am I proving that? And this is the thing about compliance, because to a large degree, compliance is proving to people you're doing what you say you're doing. And I like around that because most of there are some very, very, very specific compliance expectations in some certain frameworks, but most of them, like I said, frameworks are just like, here's a way for you to describe to us what you're doing, because I'm ultimately going to come back around and validate that you say you're doing what you're doing. Right. And I'll stop right there. If you get any questions, and I'll hold governance aside, but that right there are the two big things. And I think we need to, inside most organizations, take a step back. Because everybody, DevSecOps, the buzzwords, like, I know we'll talk about some of the stuff here, but everybody's like jumping to the latest new tool and greatest thing. It's like, hold on, let's take a step back and think about, everybody uses the people and process thing. Organizationally, what does it mean to focus, have a security, and a tactical approach to security and a tactical approach to compliance? Yeah.
And so when I think about compliance, because when you get into these bigger organizations, you have different compliance standards across different teams now. And so if you're a CISO or a CTO or something like that, how do you make sure that each group is following it, that you have maybe some reproducibility across these organizations, right? Or do they tend to work in silos and then they're all reporting up? And because then you find like when teams move now, it becomes a little bit more hectic, right? Different standards clash with each other.
Like you said, I'm trying to dig data up this, but Mike, I bet you say this, most of these standards are different. And I'll get back to some of my background. It's compositional. What you find is certain controls are more applicable to other teams than team A over team B. And so what you find is there's generally a base set of compliance and security expectations that apply to everybody. But then as you go to the silos and the different teams, they have additional ones that may be used by a couple other teams and not by some, or required by some or other teams. But it comes to a compositional phase. So I like where you're going about that. And you're talking about like the CISOs and how do you manage it. It's a compositional approach. What you want to think about, and this is where I have something about synthesis versus analytics, and I won't get too geeky here on this one, but as you start looking at it, how do you bring a composable aspect to compliance in your organization? How do you chunk and logically chunk together compliance controls, whether it's just one control or a set of controls, and provide context for how that's applied? And I think that's where the security and compliance organizations come in, is understanding how to provide that context to the team and say, okay, contextually, here's what we need to achieve. And now the team on the ground, the technical team, will implement that. And this is where people talk about, if you heard on 3 lines of defense and stuff like that, we'll get into first and second line. But that's the aspect there. And like that's how you can then manage the compliance system. And I'll say that broadly speaking, but this goes to governance. Your governance approach is that. So what do we say we're going to do? How are we validating we're saying we're going to do it? And then how do we make it objective for an independent third party to come assess that our governance process as a whole is working towards the benefit of our organization and customers? So Mike, did that answer your question? Because I love you phrase that.
Yeah, it did. One of the other challenges I find is how do you actually implement changes too? Because there's compliance, and then you maybe have a non-compliant cluster or Kubernetes cluster or something like that. If these teams are separate, how would you go about bringing it into compliance? Like, is this because the teams are separate? And let's say you have the operational team that's managing the clusters. Do they interact? Do you slowly make changes over releases? Do you like hard stop? Hey, we're not going to production unless it's compliant first, because different teams have different needs.
Yeah.
Let's say, right?
This all comes to risk mitigation. So I'll go red, green, black. I'm going to talk about red, green, and black here. But my number one rule is never break the build, unless there's very few times that you want to break the build and never go to production. And the thing about compliance is you're talking about like, how do we manage this? It's about visibility. And that's where I'm going to go into red, green, and black. Because when people say, well, we're not compliant, what does that mean? A lot of times it's like, I'll use the color red. Red's okay, I have a control and I have a way of measuring it, but I'm not meeting the expectation of that control, right? So green is like, okay, I'm meeting the expectation, but there's black, like a big black hole. And that's why I use the color black. It's like, I have a control. Do I even know if it applies, let alone am I meeting that control? And what you tend to find, and that is as funny as we're doing research for the book, is that black hole is big. And that's a lot of people don't measure. So Mike, as I recommend to people, it's like, don't break the build going into it. Remember, software, so governability is just like testability of a piece of software. So what you want to do is you want to measure where you are or not, your red, greens, and your black holes, and then treat it like a feature of the software. Because in highly regulated organizations, security and compliance is a feature of your software. And so, like you're talking about, put it in the backlog and prioritize it. It becomes let's say it's a bug at the end of the day. If this is, and the thing about that is you can build your piece of software, but the environment changed, not the software, and it can become non-compliant. And so treat it as part of the SDLC and the ideation and delivery process, such that it is a feature and it is prioritized. And the reason why is now it makes it visible and you can make a priority. And this also gets to the fact that just because you have a potential vulnerability or you have potential compliance aspect, there is always a risk decision made by an owner in the organization that they're accountable for making. And so there's no such thing as 0% risk or 100% secure, 100% compliant. The question is, what is the risk? How is the organization managing its risk? And by making that visible, never breaking the build, it puts the power inside of the decision. It puts a power in the decision maker's hands to say, okay, I'm going to make a risk decision whether to go or not go or whatever it may be. And that's really when you want to get to, because like we think about governance theater, a lot of it is just, hey, we're fine until you have the next big, whatever it is, log for shell, next big break. And then people are just like, oh yeah, we weren't as really good as we thought we were. Yeah, that's how I'd approach it, is they don't break the build, red, green, black, never break the build.
I think that's really interesting about treating it like a feature. I'd never thought about that before, because if you think about it, anyone that uses your software, right, or your applications, anyone that does, it is a common expectation, not necessarily that you are compliant, but that you are secure, right? And I think people have become more aware of that in general as, end users. And I was just curious what you thought about that.
No, I am actively dropping companies when I get my notice. I have a notice to Intuit that tells me when things have been compromised. And they even got down to the fact that I have unique passwords that can trace back to things, and I have certain unique things. And if my stuff becomes compromised by a company, I ditch that product for a different vendor. Also, when it comes down to that, like you think about security, let's talk about my financial stuff in healthcare. Like that's, yes, I need to be able to use it to my trade or transfer my money. But like at the end of the day, I don't want my information getting stolen. So like that's a feature, that's an expectation I have of the organization, is to protect that. Because at the end of the day, if they get a hold of my bank account numbers, bam, $0. And so like that is, that right there. And you think about feature, it's trust, and trust is a feature of software. And how do I trust it? And trust can be a very wobbly thing. Yeah. But I think if you think in the form of a feature, when I think like putting about a feature, is a feature is empirical. A feature should be empirical. It should be very black and white. It does or it does not operate. And if you start bringing that empirical thinking to compliance and security, then you get very declarative and explicit around what is it compliant and insecure. And that actually solves big problem in the organization of like, as I go to get my compliance or security, outcome evaluated, it's less about Kim and Mike telling me it is or isn't secure, and it's about Kim and Mike pointing to the explicit evidence to say this is why or why it isn't secure, and it becomes a more tactile conversation.
Yeah, cool.
That makes sense. I want to bring it back a little bit to Kubernetes, and this is kind of a two-parter question. First one being just in general, maybe not Kubernetes, maybe it's just containers, virtual machines in general, but what do you see as the biggest challenges between, let's say getting an environment that's out of compliance into compliance, doing it across a larger organization? And then the second part is, what did you see that relates to Kubernetes, the DevSecOps movement, and just sort of the adoption over the last 5-7 years? Because I think now we're sort of seeing the maturity curve get up there. People are actually being able to operationalize Kubernetes at scale. So kind of curious what those challenges are, and then how does it relate to the DevSecOps movement?
Yeah, so the challenges, like, first off, just being explicit about what it means to be secure and compliant. First off, let's go back to what controls apply to me and the context for why these controls matter to the organization, and whether me as an operations individual or as a developer. That right there is establish that context, and most people don't do it. Then the second part is like, okay, I talk about sort of the compliance, but then what's the process to automate that evaluation or the rectification of the compliance aspect? That becomes there's more than one way to do it. So how do you decide on the one way? And then sort of the continuous monitoring of that, how I continually evaluate that it's there. And I think as you start about the challenges getting there, that's sort of like the basic approach. But the problem is people have Kubernetes, they have AKS, they have EKS, they have OpenShift, they have virtual machines, not just VM and VMware and different type of, maybe it's just something through AWS or Google, but it's also different versions. And so this is the variability of what you have to secure and ensure is compliant to your controls. That is the biggest issue. And like when you look at like sort of traditional operations management, and this is where the idea of Six Sigma came from, like variability is what drives the risk and negative outcome. And so the idea of Six Sigma is how do you, like, what's the cost trade-off to reducing variability above 2 or 3 sigma? And so a lot of people don't focus on, this is where I pull the technology, look at the people and process, is what are we doing to reduce the variability of our environments? And because once I reduce that variability, now I can have a standard way for ensuring, RHEL and OpenShift are secure and compliant, and I don't have to worry about all these other XKS or all these different versions. And then, you start from there. So that becomes, that's the biggest problem. And a lot of that is like, that's not a technical problem. Let's be honest. That's really at the end of the organization coalescing around saying, this is what we're going to stick to and agreeing to it and marching towards it. I don't say it's simple, but the human part of it is always the more complex part.
Yeah, no kidding. I've had prior to Red Hat, I had some previous experience with, let's say, a couple different industries. And one of the common themes was containers got adopted because it was very simple to package and manage your applications. But managing them in different environments was, let's say, not necessarily as standardized at the time. So you had different teams. The data science team was doing something different, working with different data. Then you had the payment team that had a lot more restrictions on how they were managing and doing Kubernetes and managing Kubernetes. And the operations team was looking at like, we can't manage, 8 different environments. We need to sort of bring this together. But then each team had their requirements. And so it's like, how do you push back on the data science team to say, hey, you guys have to come into this environment in order for us to scale efficiently, right? So I found that you kind of let the teams go, and then bringing them back later caused a significant challenge. Do you find that?
Well, I find that there. And actually, so I love the SRE book. I love SRE, but like I'm probably the biggest advocate for things like Kubernetes and SRE that tells people not to use Kubernetes and SRE. So I'll be very careful about that. But like, it sounds really counterintuitive, but chapter 7. So what you're talking about, you think about where Kubernetes came from and its history at Borg and Google. All these people was like these individual stacks of technology. And sort of like you'll hear in the narrative, you read chapter 7, it talks about basically Google hit a plateau of automation. They couldn't automate anymore to be any more effective or efficient, fundamentally. And I'm paraphrasing here. And so what happens, they had to think of a new way of working. And so, Mike, as you're talking about, like, as you bring people together, all these different things, that's where sort of Borg came from. It was this standard, this warehouse-sized data center to where you get away from individual teams sort of operating their own tech stacks. And you start reducing the variability. So you have the container and this orchestrated. So it didn't matter what the underlying, for example, operating system was, as you built to a higher level of abstraction, which was that container. And to your point, right, that right there, that change of behavior drives the change in technology decisions as well. And so as you saw that, and a lot of other companies are seeing this as too, like, and I look at the history, that's why I like the SRE book, because it's Google telling the world about how it messed up and how it made better on its mess ups. And so like, yes, like seeing that all over the place, because to your point, it's like, well, I got Kubernetes, I got all this stuff now, how do I manage it? The answer is you can't. Don't ask how do I manage this highly variable environment. Ask the question, what am I going to do to reduce the variability of my environment? A lot of people don't ask that question, and then you pointed that out. They'll march all the way through, and they'll be like, yes, I'm going to go figure out how to do 101 plus things, and that's not how you scale. If you look at how the things, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, was it Amazon, Google, they scale by reducing variability. They have anybody, not just the things, the non-FANG companies that have figured out how to scale, they've identified the area where they reduce variability, but they've also identified where they allow variability to happen. And it tends to be in the area where it's around the customer requirements and the focus on the software to build for the customer, not sort of the standardized under the hood, stuff that, a small subset of the organization should be worried about.
Yeah, they're more in a reactionary mode to the customer and trying to get things to market or developing new features instead of actually consolidating, which will help them accelerate in the future. It's also kind of aligns with, I've seen some statistics on cost moving to Kubernetes, and the first 2 years are significantly more than they're expected. But then after, as we start to see them mature, the costs are significantly less. But I remember when I first started pitching Kubernetes, it was, oh, this is going to reduce costs, it's going to do this. But that you realize, well, if you're not structured properly, it's going to be way more expensive in the beginning, right? So it's a very interesting, let's say, transformation, right?
Well, you've nailed it. So I an audiobook recommendation, Beyond the Goal by Eliyahu Goldratt. So he was the one that wrote the book, The Goal. But in Beyond the Goal, he has 4 questions to technology adoption. So Mike, where you're going, I'll give you the 4 questions. 1, what's the power of the new technology? 2, what are the limitations it diminishes? But 3 and 4 are what the old rules you operate by and what are the new rules. And he points out, Mike, as you're pointing there, and he talks about Black & Decker and manufacturing resource planning, MRP systems back in the 60s, where people who buy Kubernetes, like, they may not see that they have to change the way they operate. And you have a large upfront cost. But once you change the new rules of operations, then over time, your total cost of ownership goes down significantly. And to your point, like Mike, as you pointed out, it's like, yeah, you can't just adopt technology for technology's sake. And all technology is an implementation of a human system. And if you look at the autonomy that Kubernetes brings because of predecessor Borg, and that's what it brought autonomy in the infrastructure, that's what you want to bring to your organization. And if you're not willing to adopt the new rules of autonomy in the organization, then you really need to question some of those technical decisions. And so, yeah, so like, as you point out, like, yeah, it can increase in the short term. Because remember, there's learning hurdles, there's investments, there's changes. Like, as much as we are very steeped in Kubernetes, we meet a lot of customers that, like, a lot of them have barely get to touch a container. And so, yeah, there's a whole world of growth to happen, and that doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen as cheap as people like to think it does.
Yeah, no kidding. Kim, you've been. Did you have anything else you wanted to jump in? I forget what's that rule again?
You gave me an opportunity to suck the air up in the room, so I just took everything.
What's the law that's the longer a group adopts a technology, the more the technology favors or like adapts to the human structure? I forget what it is. There's like a weird bias in technology. But Kim, I know we wanted to dive into supply chain security. I think you had some things lined up as well, right?
Yeah, I did. I know, Bill, when you and I were talking, you were mentioning specifically around SLSA. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that and how it relates and maybe even doesn't relate to best practices with supply chain security?
Yes. So I want to preface this. My formal background is in operations and supply chain management. So I was that person that was shadow IT because I like building software, and I built it around these concerns, not software supply chain, but supply chain and procurement. And I got myself into the tech world, and that's sort of where I came from today. And I say, look at SLSA, and you look at SLSA specifically on its website, basically says, hey, we're here to, as a response to something like SolarWinds, ensure that the developer and or the build system is not has a low probability of being exploited. And that's what SLSA right now is formulated around. And so when I think of software supply chain management, this is where I give a lot of the unpopular opinion that what we're doing around supply chain is really on the value chain, because it's not focused on, the difference between software and value chain or software supply chain. The supply chain is everything to get from raw materials to an end product, and includes all the actors in the supply chain. Then there's the value chain. That's what happens and what you do internally. And what I see happening, what I fear, is a lot of people using the word software supply chain to talk about the value chain or the things that happen inside the four walls of a company. And this is where I'm going to be careful with salsa, because it does focus. It's as you start seeing what they're trying to do with it, is it's like, okay, how do we make visible the stuff that's happening in another supply chain partner such that we have the information to do that? But yeah, as I look at software supply chain, like if you go to the Council of Supply Chain Management, they specifically don't define what a supply chain is, but they define the act of managing supply chain, and they define the interactions between supply chain actors. And that's very key, because supply chain changes, but it's the idea of how do you manage quality and risk across these series of actors. And I think that's very key as we think about software supply chain. And like Michael, you talking about, like we have the validated patterns, community patterns for software supply chain, and like that's some cool stuff. Looking at what's going on there with Tecton change, things like in Toto, like a lot of these things are coming around. But what I like to get across some leaders and organizationally is you need to start thinking about, because let's face it, open source is everywhere we're at. Even the products you buy, if it's a proprietary software, there's a lot of statistics to show that it's majority open source. And so at the end of the day, how do you protect yourself, or how do you set up methodology, or how do you set up, basically I call it quality assurance, because like I used to work at a large aerospace manufacturer. And so we'd order parts, and when they came in, a percentage of those parts were tested for conformance. And so if you look at software supply chain and this idea of conformance testing, how do you set up this sort of system, I say broadly speaking, that will validate conformance to your expectations? Now, conformance can be compliance and security, but that's where I try to push the concept of software supply chain, because that's addressing the holistic problem. And then some of these other things like salsa and whatnot, like they're great. And I'll be frank, like all this stuff is going to grow out over time, I believe, to encompass this. But of course, I get a bit on my high horse coming from the background. I'm like, oh my God, all you're really talking about is a small aspect of quality when we need to be focusing on the bigger. And this things like Sbombs, VEX, vulnerabilities, and like that actually points to the fundamental difference of software versus hard goods. But yeah, I can get on a dissertation about this all day, because like me coming from the formal software supply chain background, it's the interactions of all these actors, not just sort of one person or one entity. And so that's where I'm also trying to build a better set of, I call thought leadership, but also pragmatic advice on how to do this. Because there's 1% of companies that do really well, and there's 99% that I'll just call the average, which 99% being average is a really weird statistic. But at the end of the day, they need a very pragmatic approach. And so how could we be very pragmatic about this? And, the things like Sbombs, VEX, software supply chain, salsa, secure software delivery, and this SSDF, how do we make that such that it's I look at math, like math over 2,000 years has become standardized. We throughout the world, we do math the same. Why can't we do software like we do math? And that's sort of a personal thing of mine. It's like, how do you do that? And like, that's a big problem to solve. Doing software is a big problem, but how do we do software the same?
And finding the tolerance is very important. Coming from an engineering background, the lower the tolerance or the more specific the part or wherever you're coming from, the more you're going to have things tossed away, the higher the cost is upstream to get that part. And you have to make sure that the person that's designing, let's say this package or operating system or whatever it is, has the right people there that know how to do it, right? So it's not one piece of the puzzle, I think, that can get solved. If you're looking at supply chain and you have a tolerance for, let's say, it has to be quality contributions, it has to be signed, it has to be committed and all that stuff at all parts, well, then if your tolerance goes off in one area, then your end product is technically tainted, right? So it's, how do we find that balance between, or maybe if there's some realistic ideas that you have on how to implement it and, what you can check for?
Well, you talked about tolerance. I was talking earlier about the difference between software and hard goods. If you go to hard goods manufacturing, everything has a blueprint. Everything has a specification. Ask yourself, where is the blueprint for software? Most software is not built to a specification to where you can have more than one implementation. Most software is built, there is no specification, it's just built and people consume it. So Mike, to your point, like how do we, and like this gets back to like, this is where I try to, when people talk about hard goods and software manufacturing using a lot of lean terms and how do you build a spec? Like what you tend to see is like specs, like RSC specs tend to be derived from an implementation. But Mike, as I put to the answer, is like, how do we push more towards a standard specification for the solutions to common problems? Like, that's what software is used for. We use a lot of software to solve the common problems we don't want to rewrite other software for. And so I almost turn on its head. I don't want to answer a question with a question, but at the end of the day, I'd say the goal is, how do you drive specifications such that, Mike, as you're talking about, it defines tolerances, it defines expectations, and now you have an objective metric or measuring stick to measure somebody's implementation against. And you're not just asking broad questions like, is this secure or compliant? You're asking very declarative questions. Is it within this tolerance? And those are two different questions, although you can technically get to some similar outcomes, but two fundamentally different questions.
That makes sense. My biggest worry with the software supply chain is who creates the blueprint and who evaluates the blueprint. Is it up to whoever's consuming the software to do the evaluation? Is it the developers of the software to make sure it's up to specification? And then who's holding who accountable for the data in, let's say, an Sbomb?
Well, it's funny you say it. So we talk about standards. Like, look at, I'll get back to aerospace manufacturing. Everywhere I go, you have like ANSI standards, and you have standards for bolts and for nuts. So like literally anybody can make a bolt or nut as long as it meets the spec. So to your point where we're going, I think we have a bit of a sort of a synthesis that happens where these specifications for common stuff are taken over by a standard governing body. And so like if you look at an ANSI M3 type bolt, a 3mm bolt, those types of things, like there's specs out there. And so how do you then, is there an organization that then takes on that responsibility that says, let's say about like email addresses, here's a specification. I mean, we have RFC stuff out there, but here's a specification for email address. And I'm trying to be more system because like a lot of our software systems of systems, but sort of to where you're going is like, then when you talk about Sbombs, then it changed, it's like, okay, so you're bringing another dimension. What is the quality expectation? Where is this coming from? Then the Sbomb brings the thing. It's not just what's in here. It's also where is it coming from? And I think that even though we're trying to get to that with some of the information today with Sbombs, that becomes a big thing. It's like, I can have log4j, but did the log4j, was it forked? Where did it come from? Is it my own private repository? And there's a lot of difference to it. So like, if I can say I have log4j version 2.1.6, well, is it the one that's in Maven, or who else is it? And so I think that's where it comes, like, we talk about provenance and pedigree, like in a standard hard goods manufacturing. This is where I get back to software supply chain. Like, the supply chain is mapping, it's an exchange of goods for information. And so if you apply to the software, it's an exchange of software for information. What we don't have is we don't have that information flow. And that's where like things like Sbombs and Vex are trying to get to. But I think, to your point, that's important, but we don't have standard mechanisms for communicating. And the formal supply chain practices have built standard protocols for communicating, and standard domain practices as well. Like, I don't need to learn a vendor tool for example, in traditional supply chain to do supply chain management. I learn the domain practice of supply chain, and then I can utilize N+1 vendor tools to do what I need to achieve. I'll stop right there. I think I might go down a little bit of hole. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question, or did I just go to the...
No, 100%. It did. I want to kick it over to Kim, though. I think she had a couple things about some automation and...
I do. However, I wanted to ask a question specifically around what you were just speaking about. So I'm curious, as we talk about supply chain, I feel like over the past, 10 years, we've seen, at least 10 years, we've seen things like security and compliance become more of a business, value type of thing. So it matters to a lot of different departments and even become a boardroom problem and discussion, right? So I'm curious, now that we've seen more and more interest around how do I have my supply chain be more secure, or all of these things that we're discussing, how does that matter, like, throughout the organization? Or are we really just focusing on, people who are building the apps?
No, like, security and compliance needs to be an organizational problem. I think most organizations who've been highly regulated for years understand this. But to your point, like, and it's like, I'll just talk about like SolarWinds. A lot of this came on, not just SolarWinds, with like big data breaches before that. But what you see there is a lot of it is like, it's leaving up to the technical folks to figure out. But no, this is a business problem. There's a tactical pillar around a strategic success proposition for an organization has to focus on. So it has to be treated like a business. But one side note, like, once we start treating technology and business the same, we talk about tech versus business, like, that never works. You have to be together as business enabled by technology, and technology helping to drive the business. And so as you look at that, yes, like, it has to be a business, it has to be a formal practice in the company that technical and non-technical people can coalesce around. And, again, and, a lot of times, let's just be real, like it wasn't, I want to say it was ignored. I'll be very careful about that because I don't believe in a lot of companies it was ignored, but the emphasis put on it wasn't such until people started losing revenue and started getting, large lawsuits started happening at the end of the day. And so I think that, now, like in the past 5 years, like it's become a business problem simply because it's become a liability at the end of the day. It's always been a liability. It's just like in the hyper technology world. And this is also like, you think about the iPhone, I call it like 2007 was like a shift in technology where it became mainly consumer driven. So around that 2007 and after, we're like, now we're starting to see this because we're still really relatively new in our technology experiment in the consumer industry. A lot of people, like, think about 2007 was not that long ago.
Yeah.
And so we're learning the lessons and and so now people are learning like, yep, this has to be such a standard practice that we consider it something like marketing and accounting at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, something you touched on earlier was around managing risk. We have, security that are going in and managing risk from down to the practitioner all the way to, I think, the organization trying to figure out how to do that. And I think that comes down to secure supply chain as well. So it's interesting that you mentioned that earlier around risk management. Specifically around automation, which is what I think Mike Foster was alluding to. Can you talk to us a little bit about sort of how things have progressed there? What's the evolution been in terms of automation, and how does that really relate to the sort of the transition from DevOps to kind of, moving forward and innovating into the DevSecOps model?
It's interesting to see around the automation because you see an explosion of tools and capabilities.
Yeah.
But what happens is you're seeing there's questionable effect at an organizational level. And this talks about, like, when I talk about the adopting technology and the new and old ways of operating, a lot of people are buying tools or buying technical capabilities, but how are they achieving these secure and compliant outcomes, right? Adopting more and more stuff adds variability, which makes it difference between accidental and essential complexity makes it accidentally more complex. So I'd argue what you're starting to see right now, and some of the stuff we talk about automated governance, autonomous governance, and we talk about automating security, is really that admission, like, okay, there's a lot of tools out there. There's a tool for me to do almost anything I need these days. But how am I going to smartly stitch these tools together or bring an autonomous approach? And when I say autonomous, it's not AI, it's not ML. I go back to this is chapter 7 in the Google book when they talk about autonomous and automation, where manual automation is actually manual intervention is preferred in some instances to automation, but judicious automation is the fundamental basis of autonomous, because automation itself is not a panacea. People think like automate everything. Well, no, because automation, that's you can try to do that, but like then you have to manage it. The question is, and this goes to variability, if you automate everything, you have a highly variable, you have a lot of stuff you're automating. Why not just reduce what you're automating and be very judicious? And so cameras are going to this is the concept of autonomous, and it's in a two-way. It's like autonomously, how do I, and this is where Kubernetes, like we the Kubernetes, it's autonomous infrastructure at the end of the day. I declaratively tell it what I want to do and it does it. I don't know how it does it. I just say, hey, do this. So how can I do that for my governance and security such that I can be declarative and say, hey, here's what I want it to be? Yeah. And there's a bunch of the tools out there that under the hood can do all the imperative, they understand how to do it, but that autonomy layer, that where I as an individual can say, go do this, and I basically get feedback that it was done or it's not done and why. Like that's the next phase. And I think that's what you're seeing a lot of the industry trying to coalesce around now is how do we do this? Because we got the tools, we can stitch things together, we can automate it. Like Ansible's great for this. But again, we try to automate everything and that didn't work. And you have to be very careful because it's not the active automation that failed. It's the inability to be judicious about the automation that has affected the outcome. And that's data technology, again, back to people and process. And this is why I like to push towards non-technical leadership to help understand this stuff. Because at the end of the day, I got a background on TOGAF. We'll talk about business architecture. What we're talking about is this fundamental business process. And building and validating software and delivering software is no different than any other business process, such as inventory management, manufacturing, and operations. And once you start to approach it from that mindset, then I think some of the stuff comes into play a little better. And I basically talk about the explosion of tools. I use this term, the ERP system of software development. Like you look at like the late 80s and early 90s, like ERP systems, enterprise resource planning. There's a bunch of independent modules that people had to stitch together. Like that's where a lot of your big fours came from, right? Stitching it together. Then companies like SAP and Oracle just started buying that stuff together and plugging it as default capabilities. And so what you're starting to see is all the tools exist to manage the business of software, and the operations, but it's now putting it together in such an autonomous and cohesive way that it represents a effective business process. And I say effective first before efficient, because it's very hard to be if you're efficient before you're effective, you have some very bad outcomes.
Very
Yeah.
true. Yeah. Speaking of tools, I did have one question in the chat for you. Do you have any SBOM software you suggest or are using? I know
Yeah.
SBOMs haven't necessarily been consolidated or completely sorted out yet in the community, but thanks, Hawks, for that question. Bill, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm gonna hit this from two areas. I'm gonna not answer it, then I'm gonna answer it.
Okay.
So the thing about SBOM, actually, the NTIA put a thing together around SBOM tooling. I recommend everybody to do, and I can find the link here. But it talks about software to create SBOMs, software to ingest SBOMs, and software to transform SBOMs. And this is very key because a lot of people are thinking about creating it, but if you look at the most recent memo released on September 14th, it talks about the government ingesting things like SBOMs and evaluating them. And so that's what I like, as you look at it, understand the capabilities and the need for SBOM and more around how, if I give you an SBOM, what are you going to do with it? And this gets back to the broader around software composition analysis. SBOM is just another tool for software composition analysis. And so how do you have a broader software composition analysis approach in your organization? Now, getting more specific about that, there are a couple good tools out there. A lot of them either create it, like, so for example, you have Anchor, you have Sift and Gripe. So Sift will create the SBOM, you can create and transform. And then Gripe is they go out and you can look at different vulnerabilities. But then you have stuff like the Red Hat partner Sonatype. And what I like about sort of Sonatype's or Nexus lifecycle process is it allows you in this one tool, which it runs on OpenShift by an operator, which I love about it because the operator framework reduces the total cost of ownership when you do this type of stuff. But the idea is you have policies in there. So you can ingest an SBOM, you can create an SBOM. It's also looking at software composition. And so say, for example, stuff like ACS and then SBOMs. And so you look at like Sonatype looks at sort of that software binary, but you need to be looking at things like other layers, like container layers or VM layers. And that's where something like you can ingest those SBOMs with the APIs of Sonatype and get a comprehensive viewpoint. And so as I talk about those different tools, understand there's like the ability to create, but then how do you manage and how do you operationalize the SBOM from a compositional perspective? And so that's where, so Hawks, that's where I'm going to sort of change a bit of that question. And this is where I'm focusing right now because there's not a lot of pragmatic advice around how to operationalize this, at least that I've seen. Yeah. And that's where I want to push towards because everybody's being told to do SBOMs. And now you see the, Office of OMB laying out timelines that, the government will be then requesting or have the option to request SBOMs. But if I give it to a government organization, what are they going to do with it? And not just day one, but day two, how am I going to manage that over time? Yep. And broadly, that hasn't been addressed. And so when I talk about those two tools, I want to show the difference of sort of a tool, and I'll call it a tool because it's a bit of a suite, because it has the ability to do policy around licensing and different types of vulnerabilities. And then you have another one that just generates and transforms. And neither of them are right or wrong answers in and of themselves. But what happens is, how do you address this? And that's the question you have to ask yourself in the organization, instead of saying, what software, what are we going to do to operationalize this? Or should we operationalize this? Mm-hmm. And I'll stop right there because some people are like, oh, you have to operationalize it. But this gets back to risk management. Like Mike, you were talking about earlier, big versus large organizations. Is this really something we need to care about now? Of course, there's going to be somebody out there screaming yes, but you as a risk owner of the business need to understand that. I think that's the big thing around the non-technical leadership. What does this mean for managing my brand, my identity, and my market of my product and business?
For sure. Yeah. Thanks, Hawks, for that question. I also posted about, do we have any demos? The community supply chain security pattern is a pretty good demo to start. I think we're going to try to have Jafar on in the future. He's built a community supply chain security demo. So hopefully we can have him on to show some of the tooling. Last question for you before we head out. You're on the ground with a ton of customers, medium to big typically, and like you've dealt with all that. Any new challenges that you see popping up, automation, governance? What are you seeing just out on the field?
Yeah, so you notice like the automated governance and automating governance as part of the SDLC is becoming a big thing. But also we talk about SBOMs, procurement of software. And so what I'm starting to see as I've talked to some big organizations, even smaller, like when you look at the Office of SMB, some of their heads of procurement like, okay, how do we start procuring open source? And I say that in quotes because everybody's been using open source. And somebody's like, well, how do you procure something that's free? Well, if you look at the act of procurement, it's the act of identifying, when you talk about what's your specification, what do we need to build or buy to? Do we build or buy it? Then where do we get it from? And then once we get it in, how do we validate the quality? And like procurement's at a nexus of a lot of the supply chain activities. And they talk about inbound and outbound logistics. And so like there is a whole domain around, I'll just say software procurement in general, that's being realized and reevaluated in real time without much people talking about it. Because the traditional procurement to software is like, let's go to Microsoft, let's go to Red Hat, let's go to whomever and just buy what they have. And it was the transitive property of trust. Because we trust that you are good at what you're doing, we're just going to buy it. And we're going to ask some questions, but we're going to stop our validation there. Things like SolarWinds, like a lot of that transitive property of trust is now gone out of the window. And so it's now like, okay, we trust you because you're in business, you're doing this, but we need additional proof. And so I've had people in procurement ask me like, one, what does SBOM mean to me? How do we deal with it? Two, first off, like we know a lot of people are using open source. So how do I evaluate like a community? How, if I know there's 2 different open source projects my developers want to use, how do I know which one I need to get behind internally? And how do I know my risk to adopting this piece of software? And then 3 was things such as, changes in licenses. So the Elastic IPO. So think about that overnight when the Elastic IPO happened, all of a sudden, if your company made more than 25 million in revenue, you got to pony up. And there's a lot of companies that got caught off guard by that. And so at the end of the day, what you're starting to see is sort of like the business implications like licenses. For example, if you're using a licensed piece of software that requires you to publish what you've created by using it, and let's say you've built a proprietary system and that comes to error, like, oof, that's now a big implication. That could be, you could basically be forced to publish something that gives you a comparative advantage to the market. So now you have the non-technical people who understand the risk implications, not just from security vulnerabilities, but other aspects of business, such as IP, asking, how do we do this and how do we manage it? And so like, I'll give you my next 3-year prediction here, is there's going to be like SBOM's driving it, but there's going to be a lot more talk around how do you procure technology in a new way, a modern way. Throw your buzz term behind it. Leave it up to us vendors to find a way to architect it. But at the end of the day, that you're going to start to, people are asking the questions. A lot of these large and small organizations asking the same questions. What do I need to do this? Because at the end of the day, the board and the market and regulators are going to hold responsible, and they know that they need to. They basically, I'm saying the industry, not one company, has been caught off guard. The industry writ large. And now it's time to sort of shore up what is our domain. This is where I talk about software supply chain management. What does the domain of software supply chain management look like? And that is going to be the next 3 to 5 years getting more specific. And I see a lot of people asking those questions. And it actually, I'll be honest, like some of the people asked a question about the open source community. I was like, hold on a second, like I'm talking to a non-technical leader. Like, first I was taken back by that. I'm like, this is awesome. Like, first off, like I didn't expect this from you, but like the fact that you understand the implications on your business, like that shows you have strategic forethought in your mind. And I love seeing companies ask those questions, because those are the companies I like to use their products of, because I know that like it comes back to the risk and compliance. Like I know they're thinking of me. I talk about like Volvo. Like Volvo was more compliant and more secure than the industry standard had to be, because they absolutely valued being compliant. Like with Volvo's always being known, like if you want to be safe, get a Volvo. And like now you're starting to see software companies and other types of consumer companies around their software thinking in that Volvo mindset. Like, yes, we have to meet minimum levels, but how do we just be as secure and compliant as we need, basically because we want it and we know our customers need it.
Right. I mean, it's almost like it could be a key differentiator for organizations, to have applications that are secure and that are compliant and be able to use it that way, instead of just hiding it and treating it as a feature, like you mentioned earlier.
Like you nailed it. Like I would love, like, I'm we're all geekishly into this because of our background, but like as I look at some of this stuff, I'm just like, I'm changing the way I consume products and services based upon how secure I can see how the company is. And like even my investments are now going towards like actually who's leadership, at least for the public facing market discussions, who's leading this thought? What are they trying to do? Are they asking the right questions? Because we all know that there's not an answer to this. So if anybody comes out and says, I have the silver bullet, like I'll short that stock. So at the end of the day, but the people asking those questions, especially in public forums and trying to learn, like that's key. And like it's changing at least how I view my consumption. and also how you view my investments. Because as we go forward the next 10 to 15 years, it's going to be key. It's going to be critical. We're in this technology has become a mainstay of the consumer society, which means 8 billion people are at risk, are at opportunity for what can be delivered.
Very cool. Bill, thanks so much for coming on. If anybody wants to get in touch with you or check out your projects, your books, do you have a website, LinkedIn, anywhere you want to direct them to?
Absolutely. Always check out billbensing.com. It's a little personal thing. I love that. Got that years ago. Been great. Check me out on LinkedIn or Twitter. Those are my two main spots. Hit me up on Twitter at Bill Bensing. Hit me up on LinkedIn. Follow me on there. Join. Send me some messages. Have a conversation. Yeah, I think that's probably the two places. And then YouTube, all the things that always get put up there. I was like Bill Bensing on YouTube, and but let's chat. I would love to learn what anybody else is trying to learn out there, or learn from experiences. Because the one thing I do know that we all know is like nobody knows it all. But from a community perspective, we can bring all this information back into the community forum, and we can strengthen it. We can strengthen industry just by talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is the open source way.
Yeah, no kidding. Again, Bill, thank you so much for coming on. We'll be back December 20th. It's the third Tuesday of the month. So just in time for the Xmas break, we'll wrap it all up, all the security news for you. And looking forward to chatting to you then. Until then, I'm Mike Foster with my host.
And I'm Kim Carlos. Hasta la pasta. And we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Bye.
Bye.